And the second session is on power shifts, emerging economies, and the new world. And our first speaker doesn't need much introduction. We have seen him earlier already, dressed up as Justin Bieber. And I think we're going to sing a duet later on. I know he can do it because he's a great musician. He plays the saxophone, he plays piano, he plays the violin, but he's better known as the head of the Indonesian Investment Board, Pak Gita Wirjawan. The floor is yours.
Check. Okay, good. Good afternoon, everyone. I've brought some slides with me. In the first millennium, we had a dynasty by the name of the Shalendra dynasty, which was responsible for constructing and building the biggest Buddhist temple in the world. This was around the 7th and 8th centuries. And this is a building of magnificence, which is probably the only reason why a guy by the name of Richard Gere came out to Indonesia just 2 to 3 weeks ago. Then move on to the second millennium. We had a dynasty by the name of Majapahit, which was also responsible for basically driving governance in the right way for Indonesia and the greater region of Southeast Asia. The question that lingers amongst many of us young Indonesians is, what is Indonesia going to be doing in the third millennium? We became independent in 1945, and shortly thereafter, our first president, President Sukarno, had famously said, "You give me 1,000 people, I'll move Mount Semeru. You give me 10 young, bright, ambitious people, I'll move worlds." This is, I think, what's going to propel Indonesia the right way in the third millennium. I think if we take a look at the next 10 to 20 years, there's going to be a shift in terms of how economies around the world will change. In the first 1800 years, Asia's economy made up more than 50% of the global economy, whereas it is looking more and more like the Asia's economy is going to make up more than 50%, whether it will be by 2045 or 2050. I can simply make reference to Jeff Sachs' prediction by 2050 in that the global GDP would have risen from today's 70 trillion to about 420 trillion US by 2050. Of which Asia, or Asia's economy, will make up between 50 to 54% of the global GDP by then, which will be between 220 to 240 trillion US dollars, of which China, India, and hopefully Indonesia will make up a big chunk of that. We have heard arguments in favor and not in favor of China's becoming the most dominant economy in the world. But here, I want to talk about Indonesia. Recently, Standard Chartered has just come out with a report called the Super Cycle Report. It basically talks about where some of the global economies are going to go in the next 10 to 20 years. We know in the year 2000, the top 5 economies were the US, Japan, Germany, France, and the UK. Whereas in 2010, last year, the top 5 economies were the US, China, Japan, Germany, and France. And he says that in the near foreseeable future, there's going to be twice as many people who are going to be aged 65 years or older than those that are going to be younger than 15 years old. So what we're going to be seeing is a flip of the pyramid, whereby the top side, which is inverted, is going to be filled with old people, and the lower side of the flipped pyramid will be full of young people. But fortunately, at the rate that we are reproducing in Indonesia, at the rate of our own mortality, we're likely to be able to at least maintain our population, or even grow at 1.2% per year, and be able to maintain the demographic profile. Today, our demographic profile is such that 60% of our population is younger than 39 years old, 50% of our population is younger than 29 years old, and at the rate that we're producing every day, we will be able to maintain that demographic profile in that by the year 2025, we will still have those same percentages. This is fantastic. Fantastic as long as we infuse education into these guys. And this basically relates to the third part of my discussion. And that is about the vision for our country. Our country, the protagonist in an ASEAN context, and hopefully a protagonist in a much bigger context. A famous author by the name of C.S. Lewis once said, he's the author of many celebrated titles, including The Chronicles of Narnia. He says, aim at heaven. At least, if you don't get there, they'll throw in earth. But if you aim at earth, you will get neither. The Javanese way of saying it is, shoot for the stars. At least you can land on the moon if you don't get there. And this is about investing in the future, and the future that's going to be driven by the young people that are attending this event today. We have only less than 20,000 PhDs in Indonesia. China has more than 500,000 PhDs today. India has more than 500 PhDs today. And India produces about 1 million engineers per year and close to 1 million doctors per year. We're not producing that sort of a scale, and at the rate we're producing the number of PhDs every year, which is only 700 to 800 PhDs per year, you take a 20-year view until 2030, we will only have an addition of about 16,000 PhDs. Think about it. 16,000 on top of the current 14,000 will get us to about 30,000. Still much lower than what India has, than what China has. You think about a future where we want our kids and grandkids not to be selling coal, it's going to be tough, because India and China are and will be producing larger number of educated people. We've got to take a view on certain things, and there's really 3 dreams that we got to think about making. The first is the dream of hard infrastructure. Today, we only have 350,000 kilometers of roads in Indonesia, whereas China has about 4.5 million kilometers of roads. India has 4.5 million kilometers of roads. We've got to be able to dream that in the next 20 years, at the rate that we're going to be spending billions of dollars, that we can create at least 150,000 kilometers of roads in the next 20 years, at least 150,000 kilometers of railroads, at least 1,500 gigawatts of power generation. The math is easy. If we accumulate our GDP starting last year at 720 billion to about 9 trillion in 2030, the accumulation of the GDP will be at least 60 trillion US dollars. That's a lot of money for all of you to make. And think about it. If you take 5% of that GDP, which is the theoretical ratio or percentage of spending on infrastructure, by the way, we're not at 5% yet. We're only spending 3% of our GDP on infrastructure. If we were to spend 5% of our accumulated GDP of 60 trillion US dollars, we would have $3 trillion to spend on infrastructure. And that money will be enough to build the kilometers of roads and railroads that we have to in the next 20 years. And that's going to make things happen in terms of our purpose of industrializing ourselves. We consume steel only at 30 kilograms per capita per year. South Korea consumes 1,200 kilograms of steel per capita per year. For any nation to be a modern nation, it has to be consuming 500 kilograms of steel per capita per year. The question is, what does it take for us to become a modern nation? What does it take for us to go from 30 kilograms per capita per year to 500 kilograms per capita per year? It takes the building of about 120 million tons capacity. And it takes about $1 billion to build 1 million ton capacity. Right there, we're going to need 120 billion US. We've got to be able to consume cement at least 400 kilograms per capita per year. We've got to be able to electrify ourselves at much larger than 565 kilowatt hour per capita per year. The numbers are staggering, and it takes the building of roads and all the other hard infrastructure and the soft infrastructure, which I referred to earlier. That's education. That's healthcare. The third bit of the dream is the digital dream. Our penetration of broadband is only 18%. Much lower than what we have in Korea, much lower than what we have in India and all the other Southeast Asian countries. But our telephony or mobile penetration rate is at a much higher rate, close to 80%. A few days ago, the chairman of Google, Mr. Eric Schmidt, was in Bali to attend the entrepreneurship event for the Americans and the Southeast Asians. And he made a few startling observations about Indonesia. Notwithstanding the fact that our broadband penetration rate is only 18%, but 50% of the internet users in Indonesia are already using the mobile phones. Imagine somebody in Manokwari, in West Papua, could access the curriculum of MIT using his handphone. Imagine what kind of a game-changing that will take place. This is my favorite picture. It is not impossible that if we were to spend the money properly and appropriately in the next 10 to 20 years, that the future Steve Jobs will be born in Papua. It is not impossible that the future Warren Buffett will be born in North Sulawesi. It is not impossible for the winner of Nobel Prize in the fields of physics, mathematics, literature, peace, and all the other things will be from Indonesia in the near foreseeable future. Thank you. It is not impossible because a few things are already possible, and I'll talk about it. There's a guy by the name of Anton Suharya who studied in Indonesia and went over to Japan, and he, along with his friends, came up with a game application, which is now one of the top 10 most popular game applications in the world. He invented it. Another possibility that became real is a guy by the name of Sehat Sutarja, who only knew how to fix air conditioners 30 years ago, went over to the US and was given the kind of opportunity that he never saw. He is now running a company which generates sales of more than $4 billion per year. That's a lot of donuts. Now guys, think about it. I've talked about the shift of economies whereby Indonesia is going to be well positioned in the year 2020 and 2030. I've talked about the demographics, how we are so advantaged from a demographic standpoint vis-a-vis all the other countries, even in Asia, not to mention in Europe and in the US. I've talked about the vision for Indonesia from three perspectives. That would be the hard infrastructure, the soft infrastructure, and the digital infrastructure. I will end with a couple of adages. First one is an old adage which my parents and many people around me told me, you got to think big, but you do small and do now. As opposed to thinking small, do nothing, do later. And genius is an infinite capacity for taking pains. We have gone through a lot of pains. In 1998, we were politically and economically moribund. We were written off by so many people around the world who have written books, articles, and everything that would have told everybody in the world that Indonesia was on the brink of balkanizing. But guess what? Our fiscal portrait is as sexy as ever. Debt to GDP ratio of 26% on a declination to less than 20% in 3 years' time. Monetary portrait with fantastic ability to manage inflationary pressure like no other in Asia. And a fantastic demographic bonus. But we can't spoil it. Last, a long journey of 1,000 miles begins with one single step. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Pak Gita.